Thank you all for joining us this evening. We have been having a good time um, learning about mental health and addiction, some of the challenges that are faced, and tonight we'll continue in that journey and hopefully learn how we can continue to overcome some of these things. Welcome to those who are joining us online as well. Thank you for giving us your time. Let's begin with a word of prayer together. Father God, thank you for the privilege of life, health, and a portion of strength and the opportunity to come together and learn. I pray that as we learn, we ourselves would heal, and I pray that those who we are in relationship with might also heal. And may our healing pour out and affect those in our communities. We thank you for hearing and answering this humble request in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Brother Antonio.
All right. So I want to start out first by addressing our online viewers and the comments that have been there. I've been reading the comments. I want to encourage you to continue to share your comments with us. I may not be able to address all of them, but I did notice a comment about codependency, which we talked about on last night. And I think that probably want to just say a little bit about that. We mentioned that from the dysfunctional family, the chief enabler, if you can picture a nuclear family, the chief enabler is usually the spouse. It's usually the husband or the wife, and that is in the nuclear family, but it does not have to be. A lot of families are not nuclear, and so grandparents, grandchildren, so forth and so on. But just think about the nuclear family right now so that you can follow me. So the chief enabler is the person that actually begins to try and help. That's what enabling is. It's an attempt to help. However, it ends up making things worse, right? The problem with enabling is that in some ways a person takes ownership of an issue that is not theirs at all. Yet their life starts to revolve around another person's dysfunction. And so they find themselves on a continuous basis and for an extended period of time caring for the illness of another person that really they are responsible for themselves, while the other person is out drinking or using drugs. They're at home making sure the bills are paid and making sure the kids are together and making sure the house doesn't fall apart. Well, this can lead to our topic last night, which is codependency, which often develops in dysfunctional families, especially when there's the use of alcohol and drugs. The chief enabler becomes actually codependent. In other words, they get used to the dysfunction in the home, so much so that if the alcoholic per se were to get well, the chief enabler, who has also become the codependent, finds themselves out of place. Their help is no longer needed in the way that it was needed before, right? The problem that they spent so much of their time and energy focusing on is no longer present, right? And so there's an identity shift that the chief enabler / codependent will have to make, and that can be problematic. Now, that's one arena or one context in which we looked at codependency, but if you tuned in last night, you know that we looked at codependency in other relationships as well. Codependency at work, codependency in friendships, codependency in family as well. And I think for a larger context, I think that both men and women can become codependent. It does not matter necessarily, this is not necessarily a gender specific in that regard. In fact, I know many young men, in fact, who have become codependent, following after individuals, looking for something in individuals that's lacking in themselves. I do think, in particular to the comment, though, that was received, one thing that it did cause me to look at, and I'll have to admit to you that this is a further exploration on this particular topic, but I think it's possible for both men and women, especially in religious arenas, to become codependent upon institutions. And I think we have to really be careful about that. Now, certainly I'm not saying that you need to leave your church or anything like that. I'm just saying that we do need to be careful that our identity is not in an institution. Our identity is not necessarily in a relationship with a human being. Our identity is in a relationship with a loving God. And to look for an identity outside of that, I think could be problematic, no matter what your gender is. But specifically, I think it's especially dangerous. We have to be aware when it comes to a religious context in that regard. So anyway, more could be said about that, but I did want to address that. I do appreciate the comment. I think, it was well thought out and actually really made me think a lot. So I hope that you keep those coming. Thank you for that. So on Saturday, we talked about addiction. And we looked at disorder or choice, right? We looked at the brain, and we looked at the changes that actually happen in the brain that make it a disorder. We said that, hey, people don't just decide that I want to become addicted to fentanyl and destroy my entire family, right? No one says, hey, I want to become an alcoholic and ruin my career and so forth and so on. That because of the way that the brain works, right? The brain is a learning mechanism. It learns and then it adapts. It learns and then it adapts. It works to economize energy. So things that we do on a consistent basis, the brain works to make it easier by automating those reactions. We call those habits, and that's what happens in the brain. This is further complicated because these often repeated behaviors are accompanied by large doses of dopamine that are more than normal, right? And so because the brain sort of learned how this works, the brain stops releasing its own dopamine, and then the brain now becomes solely dependent on the dopamine from an outside source, which is alcohol, drugs, cocaine, marijuana, and as we discovered last night, codependency, which is also an addiction, right? It is an addiction in the sense that it is compulsive. It leads to compulsive relationships. So we looked at both the codependent and the counter-dependent, right? That can emerge and can develop from dysfunctional families. One of the biggest things that we discovered last night is this, is that codependency is a natural reaction to living in a dysfunctional family. So chances are, if we come from a dysfunctional family, then we have some elements of codependency. We may not have identified it yet, but that's what it is. If you missed last night, I want to encourage you to, I believe the replay is available. And so you really want to look at that because we looked at all the different characteristics and all the different ways that codependency can show itself, just so that you're aware, right? But it is certainly a reaction to living in a dysfunctional family. So now we go from there, and now tonight we talk about here working towards emotional freedom. Because last night the topic was getting unstuck. So how do I begin to do that? How do I begin to free myself, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about working towards that. And from now on, the rest of the week, we're going to talk more about working towards emotional freedom. So in the context, coming from the context of the enabler and the codependent, right? We have to ask ourselves the question, who are we? It is very clear when we are consumed with someone else's issues or problems. Who we are can get lost because we're so attentive to what's going on with the other person that we're not paying attention to our own selves, our own emotions, so forth and so on. So emotional healing and freedom comes from really taking a look at who am I? Apart from your issue and apart from your issue, who am I? And so we begin that journey here. Now, who we are is a combination of both our thoughts and our feelings, okay? And that's what we have here, right? Our thoughts and our feelings really are a result and are affected and come about by looking at our different experiences in life. And so I have a quote here from one author who says the thoughts and the feelings combined make up the moral character. In other words, it makes up who we are as a person. Now, this is not so far-fetched because when we looked at the brain, when we looked at the addicted and learning brain, we discovered that in our frontal lobe, which is the executive, executor of the brain. That's where our thoughts come from. That's where we reason. That's where we make decisions. That's where we ascribe value to things. That's where emotion regulation, behavior planning, all comes from that frontal lobe. It's essentially who we are, right? So this is not so far-fetched here that our thoughts and feelings combined make up the moral character. Who we are is intrinsic in our thoughts and in our feelings, right? Actually, there's a scripture in Proverbs 23:7. This is a Good News translation. Some of the older translations, I think, are a little bit harder to understand, but it says, what he thinks is what he really is. So who we are is really in the content of our thoughts, what we think about. And from a biological standpoint, we know this is true because whatever we tend to pay attention to and whatever we tend to focus on, right, our brain actually shapes and adapts itself according to that thing or according to that person. So this is really in harmony here. So who we are is in our thoughts. All right. So how we relate? Well, it is through our thoughts and feelings that we relate to the world around us, including the people in our lives. So from our different interactions, we have these thoughts and feelings that come up. We are relational beings by nature. We're social beings by nature. And so we have a reaction and we have a response to every person in every situation and every experience in that regards. I remember in graduate school, I took a human growth and development class, and we studied about the developmental process of human beings and individuals from different theories and philosophies. Our thoughts and feelings are influenced. The key word there is influence. Our thoughts and feelings are influenced by life experiences, including, think about this, what we see. This is really important because children learn mostly by what they see, right? You can tell them, you can, as much as you want to, but it's what they see that actually impacts their learning the most, right? And of course, their interactions and their relations. And that's why play is so important, right? That they spend those formative years really experiencing and playing around other kids. They learn cognitive skills and that sort of thing. So if our thoughts and feelings make up who we are, then we have to look at how our thoughts and feelings get in place in the first place. The thoughts and feelings that we have as adults. How did we come to that? How did we come by them? Well, life experiences, what we see, what we hear from others, what we feel, and the circumstances through which we live, even from childhood and beyond, right? Especially our family dynamics, our environment, our culture, and our society as a whole. We take in so much, first from our immediate surroundings, right? Then from society. We're constantly taking in information and we're developing thoughts and feelings from the information, from the experiences, and from all of these different levels of exposure here, okay? Core beliefs. Well, included here, that is, in these thoughts and feelings that have been influenced by all of the different things that we mentioned there, family beliefs and what we have seen and what we've heard, there's a lot of misconceptions. In other words, there's a lot of wrong information that has been inputted, right? That has been downloaded to our brains, right? False information, tragedy, suffering, abuse, and of course, loss. Unfortunately, a lot of this false information becomes part of our core beliefs, right? Now, this is really important because when we talk about core beliefs, we're talking about the motivating factor for all of our actions, right? So it goes on to say, this false information becomes our core beliefs. These are usually developed by age 7. Think about that, right? That by age 7, that character is likely already in place, right? There are some researchers that say it's much earlier than that, but we've been exposed to so much that we come to a place where that character tends to be basically set. In other words, what we're going to believe about things are basically already in place, right? But can still be influenced beyond this age, of course, as well. Now, it's very interesting as well. When you study human development, you know that the brain develops from the inside out, right? So because the brain develops from the inside out, that means that any traumas or any crises that happen while the brain is still developing, actually the brain internalizes them as more significant, more potent in terms of its impact and its influence than traumas that may happen even later on in life, okay? Why? Because it happened during the crucial part where the brain was still in its developmental stages, and the outer portion of the brain, the frontal lobe, the reasoning power of the brain is usually the last to develop. So if we experience tragedies and traumas in childhood, and for many of us, if you're like me, my very first memory, right, I was around 4 years old. It was a trauma in my life. Now today, as a 48-year-old man, I just had a birthday here, so say happy birthday to me. But as a 48-year-old man, I remember it like it was yesterday. It's like a movie. Every sight, every sound, every color, right? It's like I'm watching it across a movie screen. That's how vivid it is in my memory. Now, I don't want it to be that way, but today I know that I will never forget that. Today I know that it will always be there. Why is that memory, when I experienced so many others after that, why is that memory so clear? Why is that memory so vivid of all the other memories that I have? Well, it's because how old I was. My brain was still developing, right? So think about that. These core beliefs serve to keep us stuck, right? Or connected to painful experiences through our attitudes and our actions. So I know I've said a lot there, so I hope you're following with me here. So we're trying to get you to understand that life experiences gives us all sorts of information, but not all the information is accurate. Not all the information is correct. Information about trust, right? Information about my value, right? I may experience some things that may be negative in terms of those areas. I may grow up thinking I really can't trust. You can't really trust people, right? Well, where did that come from? Where did I get that from, right? My thoughts and feelings, my attitude about that was influenced by some experience along the way, and that stuck with me. And now that is a core belief that guides me throughout my life, right? So even in my relationships, I get married, can't trust people. It's still there, right? I may not recognize it as such, but it is there and it is impacting me, right? So these core beliefs serve to keep us stuck or connected to painful experiences through our attitudes and our actions. All right, so identifying the problem. What is the problem here? And there are a ton of words that we can use, but all of these tend to convey just about the same thing. Emotional pain, hurt, disappointment, right? Today, two very popular words are stress and burnout, right? Anxiety, and you can add to the list, and then I have down here, which is really popular if you're in school or anything like that, you're learning all sorts of things about trauma. It's not new, it's been around for a long time, but I think the pandemic probably has given us a heightened sense of awareness of this and its impact. So this is the problem. This is where we are. This is the individual who was an enabler, codependent. This is what we're dealing with, right? Individuals who grew up in dysfunctional homes, dysfunctional families. You saw things that you never should have seen. You heard things that you never should have heard. You lived through situations that you should have never lived through, right? And this is the result. This is where we're left with. We may move on, but doesn't mean that we get better. And that's what I want you to understand, that moving on is not getting better, okay? So, I'm gonna give an example of how this works here. A project, okay? So if you're online, I want you to imagine that you're in a room and you're listening to me, and I'm gonna tell you about a project that all of us are gonna participate in. Those of you who are in this room, we're gonna participate as well. Okay, we're gonna paint this room. That's our project. We're gonna paint this room, okay? We're gonna paint it blue and we're gonna paint it green, okay? And so that's our project, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you, in order to be able to complete your project, I'm gonna give you a hammer and a drill. What do you think about that? Yeah. How are you going to paint a room blue and green with a hammer and a drill gun, right? Now I want to shift your focus a bit to our emotional health. Okay? We've got, we'll go back here, emotional pain, hurt, disappointment, stress, burnout, anxiety, and trauma. How are we going to work through that if we don't have the proper tools? Right? It's like trying to paint a room with a hammer and a drill gun. Many people are not aware of the emotional tools that are necessary to work through here. Notice I said emotional tools, a set of emotional skills that are necessary to be able to accomplish this task here, right? You can't address these issues without proper tools no more than you can paint a room with a hammer and a drill gun. Does that make sense? So our project is probably going to fail miserably, right? We won't even be able to get started. We can have good intentions, right? Even the right motive and the willingness, but if we have the wrong skills, we're not going to get very far at all, right? So that's our project. What I want you to consider is the prospect of grief, okay? The prospect of grief, and I'm going to connect these dots in just a moment here. A definition of grief: the normal, natural reaction to loss, that should say, or change of any kind. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by, boy, I did a terrible job on this, please forgive me, caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern or behavior. So the normal, natural reaction to loss or change of any kind. Now I want you to go back to the codependent. I want you to go back to the enabler, who has spent years, likely, consumed with somebody else's addiction. So much so that their addiction has also become part of their own identity. And I want you to think about the types of loss that that person has experienced throughout that particular relationship. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, okay? So the normal, natural reaction to loss or change of any kind, right? And then the next part says, conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. The second part is going to be really important because as we talk about healing, as we talk about moving towards emotional freedom, that means that my familiar pattern of how I have been living, how I've been thinking and acting needs to change, right? And even though the end result is healing, it can still be very challenging, very uncomfortable, right? All right, the cause of emotional wounds, well, there are several different types of losses. There are over 40 different types of losses here, right? Death, we know that, and perhaps we, oftentimes people tend not to like the word grief because they relate it to one thing and one thing only, and that is death, right? But let me ask you something. What about the death of a relationship, right? What about change, right? Grief is also caused by change, whether it's moving, whether it's a career, a change in finances, a breakup of a romantic relationship can be devastating, right? Abuse leading to a loss of trust and safety, and of course neglect, loss of love, or loss of connection. I want you to think about these losses and how they might tie into someone who was an enabler and a codependent in that regard, okay? So, news about grief. Grief is individual and relates directly to the uniqueness of all human relationships. No two relationships are the same. That means you can't tell me how to feel, how I should feel about any loss of mine because it was mine, right? And you're not me. So my loss is unique in and of itself. Your loss is also unique in and of itself. Grief is emotional, not intellectual, right? This is very important because oftentimes we use intellectual jargon and intellectual language to deal with almost everything, including emotional problems. Except for here, it doesn't work, right? So there must be a clear separation of what's emotional and what's intellectual, right? And we already discovered that, yes, thoughts and feelings, right, define who we are. So it's not just what I believe and what I think, it's also about how I feel, right? And in many ways, you know, those two are complementary, right? I feel the way I feel because I think the way I think, so forth and so on, right? So facts are intellectual, but a real sense of loss is emotional. Grief is a crisis, and in a crisis, we tend to go back to our oldest, longest held beliefs. Those are those core beliefs again about dealing with loss of all kinds, right? Somebody told me once that the way you do one thing is how you do everything, right? And I am discovering more and more that that is oh so true. That's so true. There's a lot of misinformation out there about grief, and so there's a limited scope. As I mentioned, that many people are, when they hear the term grief, they think that, it only refers to death, the death of a loved one. And so their minds, will not sort of expand and look at grief and loss in other areas here. But we're going to do that here. And I'm going to have Tamara come up and spend some time talking to us about loss, a little bit more about loss.
All right, so tonight, as we've been kind of delving into the discussion of grief, and again, the word grief is something that has a very misconstrued idea about it. And so one of the reasons why we think it's so important to talk about this in particular, you see on the screen, it says conflicting and confusing feelings, grief. And when something is conflicting, essentially two things can exist at the same time. And we often live in a society where you can only feel this or you can only feel that. And because of that, there are a lot of people who are carrying around a lot of unresolved grief and not talking about it and discussing it because they're confused. So let me give you an example of what that may look like for a person. Let's say you have a loved one who is sick and who is dying, and they have suffered for an extremely long time. Anybody ever have been a caregiver for someone who is sick? And being a caregiver is a very difficult, long, hard position to be in. And yet, the day that loved one passes away, you are feeling several different things, right? One thing that you can feel is what? Relief. Now, there are a lot of people who are carrying around something such as guilt because they feel relieved that the person that they have watched suffering for so long is now no longer alive, right? And yet, at the same time, they have pain because they miss that loved one. And so again, conflicting or confusing feelings. Am I supposed to feel happy that the person has died? And so you begin to go through this turmoil mentally. So conflicting things, two things can exist at the same time. And I think it is one of the more relieving things that we can accept in this process. Oh, am I going the wrong way? All right. And so it leads us into this maze. And remember what he mentioned earlier about the facets of grief. We also like to talk about it from the elements of loss and change, right? Because when we go through changes in life, we can grieve those changes. And let's give an example of what that can look like. How many of us have children and, when they're little and they're dependent upon you and they need you for everything, right? And yet they're growing older every day and less asking you for your help. They don't need you to tie their shoes anymore, don't need you to fix their cereal anymore. And then one day they're gone, living their lives, right? And so because we've experienced that change, I've lost something, right? Who am I now, right? Who am I as a mother? Who am I as a father or a caregiver, a grandparent? And so we find ourselves going through these emotional mazes, and it can be a challenge. Or let's say our own changes, right? Our identities, our personal identities. Let's say I have a profession where I've worked as a nurse for years, and now I'm moving towards retirement, right? Who am I? Okay, so grief does not only center around death. Grief can send us into these emotional mazes of loss or changes and adjustments in life. So we've just given you some examples of loss and changes. Let me ask you, what can you think of? What are some losses and changes that people can experience that are not centered around death? Moving, relocation. That is actually a really huge adjustment and change for a lot of people that is never discussed. That is awesome. Anyone else? Finishing, oh, say it, sir. I'm looking forward to that. But yes, finishing school, right? Let's say you've been a student for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and now you've reached a point where you are done. What next, right? Anyone else? One more. A change. Thank you. A change of job. I actually was talking to someone recently as we are walking through this particular process. And you know what they discovered? They have worked at this particular job all of their life, and they recently were laid off. And they are going through a crisis, right? Who am I when I don't have to wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and go to this job? I've been doing this for 20 or 30 years, right? So again, examples of different areas of grief that people can go through that cause a lot of emotional turmoil, right? So here is another slew of all of the different types of changes or losses that people can experience. And by no means is this it, but this is just to give you some. And some of these things you've already expressed. Pet loss. And I want you to pay close attention because there are 2 losses on here that are the least discussed and acknowledged, okay? So we have pet loss. We have loss of a special item. Anybody ever had something sentimental and you've lost it? Oh, goodness. Moving. We talked about that, right? Moving to a new home, city, state, or even country. Next, we have starting school, okay? Death of a spouse or a family member. Marriage, divorce, graduation, end of addiction. Do you know when we talk about that, oftentimes people are like, wait a minute. Why would I grieve the end? Don't we want the addiction to end? I want us to remember that those who are experiencing the end of an addiction, as we are talking about those in codependency, it could be the person who has the addiction or the person or the people around the person who are seeing them change, right? We also have loss of health, retirement. We have financial. It can be positive or negative. I personally would love to see the positive, not the negative. We have holidays, legal issues, empty nest. And there is another one that is not on here, miscarriage. And so the 2 least discussed losses that people experience and yet leave people so incomplete are pet loss and miscarriage. Let me ask you something. What do those 2 things have in common? You may say, what in the world would pet loss and miscarriage have in common? What do you think? Personal, okay. I like that. Yes, it is personal. Anything else that comes to mind? Why would pet loss and miscarriage be the least discussed losses that people experience? Difficult, right? Let me share something with you. Pet loss and miscarriage tend to fall up under the category where people carry a lot of guilt and shame. One being, when someone miscarries, oftentimes they are left with the thought of, what could I have done, right? Was it my fault? Why me, right? Did I do something wrong? Next, pet loss is in that category where we feel like I don't have the right to mourn a pet. I won't walk into a room full of people and cry over the fact that my dog just died. Why not? You think people might judge you, right? I mean, it's just an animal, right? And so imagine those 2 losses being the ones that people silently carry around in a lot of pain and never get an opportunity to actually voice out loud. So those are interesting ones to keep in mind, okay? So now we're talking about the enemy's strategy to destroy the human race and God's strategy to restore. And it's because we're talking about these particular areas where we don't actually have conversations, right? Now, there are 2 different categories. You have tangible losses and you have intangible. The ones that we just looked at in that one list, right, were what we call tangible. You want to know why? Because we can touch those. We can taste them. We can feel them. We can see them. But you want to know what some of the most deadly ones are? The intangibles. Here are a list of intangible losses. We have the loss of trust, loss of safety, loss of security, a loss of innocence, a loss of control. Anybody ever felt that? I personally, I don't like not having control. I can confess that today, right? A loss of control, a loss of identity, loss of expectations. And here are 2 that are very, very interesting. A loss of hope and faith. The reason why I want to hone in on these last two, because they all are very significant, right? Very significant. But the last two tend to fall in a category that are very elusive for people. You ever had some expectations for yourself or others, and those expectations were never reached? Or I've lost hope, right? Or a loss of faith. And I want to say this. It is important for us to understand that all of the things that we're talking about throughout this week are to help us to recognize that when we hear people say, I've lost my faith, right? It is not something that we necessarily have to feel extremely afraid of. If a person is allowed to walk through a process of grief, meaning they are allowed to acknowledge, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, right? Acknowledge what has actually happened in their life. If they are able to go through a significant process, do you know that it statistically has been proven that most people are able to bounce back and regain their hope and their faith? But it is when we do not feel safe or in a community or an environment that would allow us to, that we hold these things to the cuff and we do not talk about them out loud. So we suffer silently. So in all of these categories, these can be some of the most dangerous losses and griefs that people can carry, and we won't even know it. People will show up in our lives. We can live with them in our homes. We can be acting and behaving, and yet behind the scenes, these are all of the things that I am grieving a loss of. So these are what you call intangible losses. Now, emotions, when we are not able to process the emotions that go along with these losses, it is kind of like being locked up, locked away. And listen, when it comes to actually living a life of freedom, living a life not locked away, it is important for us to be able to acknowledge all of the things that we just brought out, right? The tangible and intangibles. And so it is not a goal that we would walk around and we would not be aware. Now, what we do know is this, is that for a lot of us, we don't have an emotional vocabulary, right? This is something that is very important as you are processing losses and change. Emotional vocabulary are things that help us to be able to identify what is it that I'm feeling. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had someone come to you and say, well, what's wrong? And you're like, I don't know, right? I know something is wrong, but I wasn't necessarily raised in an environment or cultivated in soil that gave me words to be able to depict or share, this is what I am feeling. Or maybe you were in a household where they were sharing emotions and feelings, but they weren't actually the most productive ones, right? So emotions are also very important, but emotional isolation is very dangerous. Emotional isolation of any kind, honestly, can be very dangerous. But emotional isolation, when we are stuffing and we are hiding and we are not able to actually bring up and out the things that are actually taking place, it is something that resides here. And when we talk about our hearts, we're really talking about our brains. Right? So what we end up doing is we end up having this situation where we have compounded emotional loss and trauma. Okay? So unresolved grief is cumulative. You see that picture, right? A dump truck. So you may say, well, why is this important? Well, some of us probably have been in environments, again, where the messages that have been given to us say, just get over it. Right? Get past it. Move on. But these are things that are actually not intellectually honest, right? Because we never actually just get over it or move on. What actually ends up happening with things that are unresolved is it collects like a dump truck in our brains, in our hearts. And let me tell you something. All it takes is the right circumstance or situation to come along. And that dump truck, oh, let me tell you, you know that nasty juice that comes? I know, right? I hate using that imagery, but it gets everybody because everybody at some point has witnessed it, right? It is horrible. Well, let me tell you something. This has the exact same effect. That residual stuff that comes out, right? You ever been in an environment with someone who has unresolved griefs or issues, and that juice is just kind of trailing behind him? It's like, and it's the most horrible smell, isn't it? It's even when the dump truck is gone, you can still smell the stuff that's on the street. So this is why unresolved grief, or let's change the word, unresolved change or unresolved loss is cumulative. And if we do not process through it, if we do not actually have tangible tools that we can use to help us to discover what it is that is unfinished, this is what happens. And it is never good. It's not good for us personally in our relationships. And we leave a trail behind us of icky stuff. Okay? And so I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Tamara, for that. Okay, so let's talk about what we tend to turn to when, as an alternative from facing and dealing with our pain, right? And you may recognize some things on this list. Some people, so let me just explain, short-term energy relieving behaviors. These are behaviors that perhaps some of them in and of themselves are not bad, but it's our motive behind why we do them, right? And if the motive is to cope with the pain, to deal with the pain, then it becomes what we call a STIRB, and that's just short for short-term energy relieving behaviors. So some people turn to food, right? Some people turn to anger. And I will tell you and just take a time to be transparent with you. I was having a conversation with my brother a couple of weeks ago, actually, and we were talking about anger, right? And I was telling my brother, like, hey, you know, I really realized as a young man, you know, why I was so angry, but I didn't realize it until it was, you know, much later on in life when I was going through this process myself. So number one, I'm not telling you anything that I haven't been through myself. But number two, my brother's response was, well, you always have been angry. I remember you always being angry. I don't ever remember a time where you weren't angry, right? And I said, well, that may be true, but but I actually realized where my anger came from as a young man. My mother used to tell me, son, you act like you're mad at the world, right? That's what she would tell me. You act like you're mad at the world. And in some ways I was, but I didn't know why I was angry. I didn't have the answer to that, right? Until I started going through this process. When I was about 4 years old, I told you that I had a traumatic memory there. Not long after that, my mom and dad were separated, right? And I remember that, and this is very interesting because my brother was present, but in my mind and in my memory, I don't remember him being there. But when he talked about the event, he talked about the event like he was there. I'm like, wait a minute, were you there? Tune him out, right? So I was about 4 years old later on, and I remember mom came, mom was standing with us, and a man came and picked us up in his car. This man wasn't my father. I didn't know who this man was, okay? What I do remember is that I was angry. And I remember I was sitting, my mother was in the front seat. The man didn't say anything, but I was kicking the back seat of the car. I kept kicking it and kicking it and kicking it. And the only thing my mother said to me was, stop. You need to stop. And I was so angry. And I continued to be angry even until early adulthood. Today, because of going through this process, I realized why I was angry. I was angry because that wasn't my father, and my mother never talked to me about who it was. My mother never talked to me about the change in relationships that she had made. All I knew was I lost my father. And from that point in time, my mother and father would never be together again. That was devastating to me. That's why I was kicking the back seat. That's why I was so angry. But I was 4 years old. I didn't know how to express that. And you know what? And nobody asked me either. Why are you so upset? Nobody ever asked me. I knew what I was feeling. And so sometimes when you think about that when it comes to loss, sometimes we feel things that we never give a voice to. We feel things that I never gave voice to that. And all those years, I had no idea why I was so angry. But that was the genesis of my anger, right? And so that shut my brother up, by the way, as well. Social media, right? We get lost there. It's no wonder people can spend hours scrolling and surfing. Hours, right? Movies and television. I've got anger on there twice. Drugs and alcohol as well. Oftentimes, because of certain traumatic experiences and certain losses in life, people turn to drugs and alcohol, and these become problematic in and of themselves, as we've been talking about shopping and video games and pornography. And what about serving others? Serving others, right? And so in many ways, codependency shows up in that space as well, right? And that can be really challenging. And as Tamara mentioned, this isolation, where we keep people at a distance. We keep people at a distance, right? It's what I do when I'm reminded of my pain. I retreat to be alone, right? Not to mention, I got a message when I was young, when I was a kid. Nobody said this to me, but this was the behavior. Grieve alone. I was crying over a dog that I lost. And the response was, go to your room. What's the message there? Grieve alone. Grieve by yourself. And so when I'm reminded of my pain, this is what I turn to there. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about unfinished business, and we're going to wrap up here in less than 10 minutes. Unfinished business, that's what we call it. Those emotional wounds, that emotional pain, that hurt, that disappointment, that anger, that loss, that grief is unfinished business. Emotional incompleteness is another way for it. Emotional incompleteness often leads to a relationship with the pain of loss, negatively impacting our identity and our relationship with others, right? And oftentimes, what happens here with this pain of loss and this pain becoming our identity is that it changes our personality if we're not careful. It impacts who we are, right? We have learned to live with this, and we have so digested this that it impacts who we are and how other people see us. So to communicate with me is to communicate with my pain. It is to communicate with my hurt, right? And it is to impact all of my relationships in that regard. Incompleteness, let's talk about that. And it's no coincidence the words that we're using. Unfinished business, right? Emotional incomplete. What is emotional? What is this emotional incompleteness here? This relationship with pain. Incompleteness is not limited to major events. So I don't want you to think about, big events. Certainly there are big events that happen, but it's not limited to just the major traumatic events that people might experience. It is an accumulation of undelivered communications, large and small. So I told you that nobody ever asked me about it. I didn't know why I was angry, and so I never spoke about it, right? I've never spoken about it, right? So that was an undelivered communication, right? So the things that we feel that we don't speak about represent undelivered communications, large and small, that have emotional value to us. It is essential that we complete what is undelivered for us. In other words, we find a way to deliver these communications. Sometimes incompleteness is caused by our actions or non-actions, right? Other times it is caused by circumstances outside of our control. The point is, and that's taken from the Grief Recovery Handbook, the point is that this idea of incompleteness, you and I cannot be the best versions of ourselves as children, as mothers, as fathers, as members of our community with incompleteness. We can't be the best versions of ourselves. Completing the relationship with the pain of a loss. And let me say this, oftentimes I can remember some losses in my life where, I lost that person. And so because I could not have that person, do you know what the next closest thing to that person was? Can you guess what was the next closest thing to that person? It was the pain of losing that person. I substituted the relationship with them for a relationship with the pain of losing them, because that's all I had. That's all I had, right? And I know that sounds like kind of weird, like, well, why would you do that? Well, that's just, it just happened like that, right? It just happened like that. And I didn't even recognize that, until I went through this process, until later on I really began to understand. So I want you to think about the areas in your life where you may have incompleteness, right? And by the way, I should say this as well, as we've already, as Tamara did such a wonderful job of explaining, people don't have to be dead for us to have incompleteness. There is incompleteness through estrangement as well. When you're estranged from people, there are so many families that children that are not talking to their parents, parents not talking to their children, so forth and so on, and so people are still living, and we have incompleteness, right? And we have emotional pain. We have lost the relationship with that person, right? And we just go on. It never ceases to amaze me. Brothers and sisters grew up in the same home. You're not speaking. You haven't spoken in 20 years. Over what? What's happening there? What has happened there? All right? So this incompleteness. I have a little time to talk about the F words, but I will make mention of them because this is a whole seminar by itself. But oftentimes when we make this journey toward emotional freedom and completeness, there is fear, right? There is a fear of whether or not, I know when I went through this process, my fear was, is this even going to work? Is this worth it, right? What's the outcome here? There's always a fear of the unknown. When we start taking emotional steps that we've never taken before in our lives, we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so there's some fear involved. Familiarity. Tamara talked about addiction being one of those tangible losses, right? Let me tell you something about addiction. It's very familiar. It's very familiar. Same people, same places, same routine. It's the same play over and over and over again. It's very familiar. Now, I get in the early stages of recovery. Those same people are gone. Those same places gone, right? So when in addiction, my circle is like this. When I come into recovery, my circle shrinks, and now I have to start over again. And now everything is so unfamiliar. That codependent spouse or grandmother or grandchild, when their loved one gets recovery and come back into the family circle, guess what? Even for the codependent, even though the alcoholism was ripping the family apart, guess what? He or she was predictable. I knew what to expect. I knew what to say, and I knew what not to say. Follow what I'm saying? I learned that, okay? I could do that in my sleep. Now they come on talking about they got this recovery. I don't know what to expect. Where do I belong? What are their emotions going to be like? How do I interact with them? I got to learn a new language. I got to learn something different now, right? This is very unfamiliar. And that's why oftentimes many family members says to their newly recovering loved ones, I liked you better when you was drunk or when you was high. Why? Familiar. Why? Because they need to grieve the loss of their alcoholic or the drug addict. They're no longer that person anymore, and you need to grieve them. You miss that person. You want that person back because it's familiar to you. And now this new person is bringing up all this pain. You have no idea what to do with. And really inside, you're angry and you're resentful. Because all the effort that I put in to try to get you well, you go somewhere else with some strangers, and they help you get well? No, I'm not happy about that. But I'm not going to tell nobody I'm not happy about it. All right? Forgiveness. Okay, again, this is a longer conversation. I would just say this, that for those of us who have been hurt by people that we need to grieve, right? This is not about condoning. Forgiveness is not condoning, right? Forgiveness is something that I must do for me so that I can be free, right? And that's what this is about. Again, we can say more about that maybe another time. We'll spend more time just on the F words there. So if you thought those were going to be bad words, they're not. Academy Awards. As human beings, we can act recovered. If I'm hurting and I'm in pain and you say, hey, Antonio, how you doing? Chances are a very human and very common response is, I'm fine. You know, it just comes out automatically, right? It's like it's wired into our DNA. That's why we call it Academy Awards, right? We need to get an Oscar for that. Saying I'm fine merely distracts us from others, while pain and loneliness persist on the inside. The net effort is to create a scab over an infection, leaving it a mess underneath. Those are the I'm fines, right? I'm fine is a lie. It's a lie to ourselves, it's a lie to others. How many times have you ever said I'm fine when you were feeling terrible, right? Every time we lie to others, we lie to ourselves, right? Our subconscious mind hears the lie and continues to bury the feelings generated by the initial event. Unresolved losses are cumulative and cumulatively negative, right? Time does not heal the pain caused by loss, neither does lying about our feelings. Remember, the knowledge or intellectual awareness, even if it's spiritual in nature, I have to talk to my spiritual people, my church-going folks, my people of faith, because we're really good at that, you know, telling people things like, you know, God's will, right? How do you know that? How do you know that? Right? Or this, you know, God never gives you more than you can bear. You know, we know what to say, intellectual stuff, but it does nothing to heal the heart, right? So, even if it's spiritual in nature, does not create resolution to the emotional incompleteness caused by loss. Emotions are emotional, intellect is intellectual. It's time to take the actions necessary to complete the relationship with your pain caused by loss. Emotional freedom comes with grief recovery. Grief and loss is something that I must recover from. It's the result of completing the relationship with the pain of the loss or change, right? It's a result of using a set of proper emotional skills or tools, right, to paint this room like we talked about, right, that allow me to be the best version of myself. What are those action steps? Well, here are the action steps in a nutshell. Number one, awareness. I need to be aware of my emotional incompleteness. I need to be aware of my unfinished business. Where are the relationships where I have unfinished business, right? Where that trail is following me everywhere that I go, that I need to actually develop some completeness. Where is the emotional pain in my life? And then I have to have some acceptance. I've got to accept some responsibility, right, for the unfinished business. I have to accept that the efforts of recovery are up to me. It's in my hands to be able to do that. And then as we talked about the undelivered communication, I've got to have that recovery communication. What is it that I need to say? What is it that someone needs to hear me say? What do I need to say that I never said? Because I was maybe afraid. I didn't feel that the environment was safe or trustworthy. Remember the 3 unwritten rules of the dysfunctional family? Don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. Those become a part of my core beliefs, right? Don't talk because nobody's going to listen. Don't feel because they'll never be validated. And don't trust the good times because the bad times are just around the corner, right? So I need to have recovery communication. I need to be able to communicate what I have failed to be able to communicate up until this point in my life. Maybe there are some apologies in there as well that I need to be able to say, that I need to be able to ask for, that I need to be able to deliver and communicate. And if I'm not at the point where I'm ready to apologize, can I at least acknowledge that there is something there? And I'm working on it. I remember when I worked in a treatment center, we would do family day, and we would have the family members of the clients come, and we would have them do what we call list work, and they would sit across from one another. And we would tell the family, now, as you hear your loved one apologize, you can say, your responses can be one of 2 things. I forgive you, or I'm working on it, right? This acknowledgement is to say, I'm working on it. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it, right? I'm working on it. And then finally, maintenance, or having the ability to be able to move beyond the loss. Once that communication is delivered, right, now I put myself in a position where I can begin to move beyond the loss. And that's, of course, what we want for our recovery. All of this is possible, and this recovery is a very personal work. It can be done through experiencing grief recovery by a trained grief recovery method specialist who can certainly take you through this work. You see my information there. I'm certainly a grief recovery method specialist. An advanced grief recovery method specialist just means that I don't have to be where you are. We can do it. I can be in my home in Ohio. You can be here, and I can do that with you. Also, Tamara is also here in Michigan, and she is an advanced grief recovery method specialist as well. She can do this work with you as well. We do both individual and in group. And of course, if you just want someone, anyone else, there's a number there that you can call. There's a website you can go and you can look up grief recovery method specialists in your area. There are many that are trained throughout there. I have specific, and I'll close with this, I have a specific priority audience. My priority audience for grief recovery work, well, I'll give you a few of them. One of them is family members that have lost loved ones due to addiction, okay? Their daughter, their son, you know, especially throughout this opioid epidemic, many families have been greatly affected by the loss of their loved ones due to use of heroin and fentanyl. So my special work is with families who have lost family members and loved ones there. My other special work, my other priority group is men who have estranged relationships with their children or poor or negative relationships with their children, and working with men, because as men, I've discovered that rather than deal with our emotions, you know what we do? We go to work. We go to work. This is one of the reasons why I believe that women generally outlive us. Because the nature, oftentimes, of women is that they will reach out and they will share. And I'm not saying everybody, but for the most part. But men, we have a problem doing that. Because it's not very manly to say, I'm hurting. It's not very manly to let another man know that, hey, I was crying because, you know, I really miss my son. You know, I don't have a relationship with my son, and I'm really hurting. I'm devastated because of that. That's not the manly thing to do. The manly thing to do is to keep your mouth closed and just go to work, right? Tuck your head down and go to work, unfortunately. And so that's one of my priority groups there. So I want to encourage you that there is work to be done. Most importantly, I want to encourage you that recovery is possible for anyone and everyone if you are willing to do the work. And with that being said, yes, we'll take one or two questions if there are any questions. We kind of went over our time. I knew it would be a little bit longer this evening, but does anyone have any questions that come up for you through this presentation this evening? Yes.
Yeah, what I was thinking of when you were mentioning earlier, there were circumstances sometimes, especially with men, like what you're crying about, you're a man, be a man.
Yeah, man. Man up.
Yeah,
Man up.
You know, that kind of attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and we hear that, right? And that's perpetuated, right? And even our little boys, you know, when they're growing up, what you crying for? You know, don't cry. We teach them very early. Ain't no crying. We don't do that, right? We don't do, You're a man. Brush that off. Keep going, you know? and we grow up with that. We grow, and that's the message that we receive. And that becomes a part of our core beliefs. And we're raised with that. And our attitude and our actions reflect that sentiment, right? I remember, I don't know if my brother remembers, but our dad used to smack us on the chest. I mean, not in a disciplined way, but just, boy, you all right? Can you handle that? You know? It's like we're supposed to be able to handle pain. We're supposed to be able to handle emotional hurt and keep going, right? And that can be problematic. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You mentioned, I think you mentioned acceptance, and I just want you to be clear. Maybe you would say it again, that you're not a person who has been wronged, is not accepting responsibility for the wrongs that have been done to them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. That's good. So, yeah, we're talking about acceptance as far as accepting responsibility for recovery, accepting responsibility for your wellness. You know, if I can, because a lot of times what happens is we like to blame. And as long as I blame you, then, you know, the problem remains with you. And therefore, I don't have to take any responsibility to get well because it's your fault. You did this. So I have to be able to take, at least 1% responsibility, you know, for my emotional state, for my unfinished business is now the ball is in my court, right? And I have to accept that as opposed to blame other people. And I'm not saying that other people are not at fault, right? But they are not in control of whether or not I become emotionally free. That's a decision that is within my power to make. Yeah, yeah. So.
Can I say something else? With regards to your, what might have caused part of your pain, in the Caribbean, you find people, they don't tell children stuff because it's too much for you. They don't want to get you like, you're a child. If I'm in a relationship as an adult, they look at it as a protection, not getting you involved because you cannot understand relationship.
Yeah.
And but then you, the child, now not understanding it from that point of view, you're looking at it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know how it is handled, but
Yeah.
but a lot of times it's just like, for example, people go and they leave their children at birth on a step to be adopted. Most times the kids look at it like, why did you adopt me and so on so. They wouldn't have understood it. Most times when, as an adult, sometimes the parents are so ashamed, I couldn't take care of you and I knew that you would have a better life with somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the fact is never going to change that I'm still your parent. When you understand that, or when I tell it to you, I want you to understand it, because you will have children and at some point in time, you find yourself in these circumstances where you cannot meet the needs.
Yeah.
And you have to do something, and sometimes it's very hard.
Yeah. No, that's sure, and that's an adult perspective that makes sense, and it's the truth. I would just add to that if we never have the conversation, then how am I supposed to know that? And see, what happens is, here's what happens when, and I'm not saying that you need to have the conversation at 4 years old, but at some point, you know, as you know, as you see certain behaviors persist, certain attitudes persist, at some point, age appropriate, you may want to have that conversation. But what happens is, when the conversation does not happen, I am left to come to my own conclusions about the situation. The problem is that those conclusions then become a part of my core belief. And so much later on, when you want to talk to me about it or when it comes up, my mind is already made up. I'm not trying to hear any excuse. I'm not trying to hear anything that you're saying, right? Because that feeling, those thoughts and those attitudes are solidified for me, right? Over years, and I have re-indoctrinated those feelings and thoughts by what I've told myself, you know, that sort of thing. So at some point I would say, yeah, think about, you know, the conversation there. Hold on one second. Yes, you had a question?
What about the other type of isolation, like where somebody is literally being held like as a hostage type, or like a scapegoat, where the addict is like scapegoating somebody, and usually it could be a family member, and they're keeping them isolated like their own child, and that person wants to be social or go to school, but the family member who's the addict is like,
doesn't allow them to do that. Yeah. Well, that's definitely sounds like a huge loss, a ton of losses in that scenario for that individual, a ton of losses, and maybe even some trauma for sure associated with that as well. And so again, as we discussed, you know, our unresolved pain may be from situations that are outside of our control. Because certainly if I'm in that situation as a minor, what can I really do, right? What can I do? And so unfortunately I'm left, you know, with the emotional damage and the emotional scars of that experience, you know, that hopefully there's, you know, somehow, some way there's some level of intervention where I can forgive, where I can, you know, become emotionally free from that, right? Because whatever my emotional culture is, unfortunately, I take that into my relationships, you know, with my children. I take that into my relationships, you know, with my partner and so forth and so on. So, yeah. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much. We're well over time, but I appreciate the level of engagement. I hope that this has that this has brought and shed some light for you on your path as well. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, again, thank you all who have joined us online, and thank you for those who have come here to spend this time in this space. Let me just offer a word of prayer to close us out. Father God, thank you that healing is possible for each and every one of us, whether we have lived with someone who has been on a journey with their addiction, or whether we've been estranged from someone who's had an addiction, or whether we've just been dealing with our own addictions. The fact of the matter is, no matter where the pendulum swings, healing is possible. Thank you for that message, which was loud and clear this evening. Now heal us, and we will be healed in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you all. Have a good night. We'll be here, same time, same place, tomorrow, 6:30. What will we be talking about tomorrow at 6:30?
Tomorrow at 6:30, we'll be talking about conflict in our relationships and how oftentimes the conflict in our relationships point to undelivered emotional communications and incomplete emotional needs.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We'll see you. Have a good night.